it now? Excellent. Oh, come on. Check 1 2 1 2. 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 All right, I think we're good here. Just one moment. Yes. I thought you were needing to keep going.
My favorite sound check is 1, 2, 3, 4. Can I have a little more? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I love you. Paul McCartney.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Brandon Fess with the Local History and Genealogy Division here at the Rochester Public Library. Today we're proud to present Rochester versus Buffalo, Emma Goldman in the Dawn of America's Century. Once labeled the most dangerous woman in America, Emma Goldman emigrated to Rochester from what is now Lithuania in 1886. Though her family would remain rooted in the Flower City, she deemed Rochester to be a drab, industrial town and moved to New York City after living here for only 3 years. She would go on to become an international advocate for anarchism, free love, and the labor movement. A fiery orator and prolific writer, Goldman became implicated in the assassination of President McKinley and was later deported during the anti-immigrant Red Scare era. Join Honorable Richard A. Dollinger as he details how Emma Goldman's life intersected with the life of the first federal judge in Western New York in a series of events that symbolizes the dynamics in America at the dawn of the 20th century. Our presenter today is the Honorable Richard A. Dollinger, who is a retired judge of the New York Court of Claims, assigned to the 7th Judicial District as an acting Supreme Court Justice in the matrimonial part. He is a graduate of St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto and the Albany Law School. He was a trial lawyer for 28 years. His public service includes 5 years in the Monroe County Legislature and 5 years in the New York State Senate. He is currently a member of the Advisory Committee on Judicial Ethics, and he has published more than 100 opinions on family law matters in New York and has written dozens of articles on historical and legal topics, including the Married Women's Property Rights Act in New York, the right to privacy, memory evidence, hearsay, excited utterances, and the rules of evidence applied to the songs of Billy Joel. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard A. Dollinger.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming on this somewhat overcast day to learn a little history lesson about Rochester, New York, in my opinion, its most famous daughter, immigrant daughter, and how America was turning in the latter part of the 19th century and the early 20th century. I want to thank Emily Morey and Brandon Fess and the people at Christine Radarski, who's the city historian, I want to thank them for this invitation. We have been in communication on a number of issues, and when I told them about this lecture, they asked me to come, and I want to thank them for getting me here. Today, what I really want to do is usher you back to a completely different time in America. And it really starts with, from our point of view and a local point of view, what turns out to be a competition between Rochester's most famous daughter and one of Buffalo's favorite sons. Go back to the 1880s in Western New York. Both Buffalo and Rochester were boom towns. The effect of the Erie Canal was that in the post-Civil War period after 1865, Rochester and Buffalo both exploded in population and in industrial might. Buffalo in 1880 was the 8th largest city in the United States. It was a Great Lakes port, and of course it was the terminal, the western terminal on the Erie Canal, which allowed goods to flow downstream to New York City and the rest of the eastern metropolitan areas at a substantially reduced cost. So Buffalo and Rochester were two of the parts of the Industrial Revolution in America. Rochester had its own industrialization, largely driven by the flour mills in the Genesee River, which originally allowed the graining of wheat into flour, but eventually also created a source of power for Kodak, Western Union, fascinating story there of some other Bausch and Lomb, Henry Bausch, and came to Hickey Freeman. It became a huge center for the garment industry in New York. But two very different people emerged from these two cities in the late 1880s. Chapter one is Emma Goldman in Rochester. She was born in Lithuania, which was then part of the Russian Empire. She came to Rochester in the mid-1880s as a seamstress to join her sisters. Her father was a staunch conservative who wanted her to simply prepare gefilte fish and have babies. That was Abraham Goldman's message to his daughter. There's evidence both in her biography and elsewhere that she was abused by her father as a child, even before coming to America. So she comes in the mid-1880s, but she suffers from the handicap that most immigrants did, which is she did not have an ability to speak English, and she lived in poverty. Interestingly enough, in her biography, she says, her autobiography, she says that almost from the moment we landed in New York City, we knew that conditions in America were not going to be all that different from Russia. Living in poverty had been the hallmark of the Jewish community in Lithuania when they were under Russian domination, and she came to America and found that things weren't much better. She became a seamstress, and she slowly but surely started to pick up the English language. She worked for 10 and a half hours a day for $2.50 a week. Now, people have said to me in other lectures, what does that constitute today? Probably something about $25 or $30 a week, that $2.50 per week. So it wasn't enough money to do much of anything. She described her work there as working in a crushing industrial machine. Her sister had a child. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes, and she left the workforce. Emma Goldman, in her autobiography, tells the story. She went to her employer, a man named Jacob Garson, who was a significant figure in the Russian immigrant Jewish community in Rochester. And interestingly enough, he is the great-grandfather of a friend of mine, Linda Garner Goldstein, who was in the Monroe County Legislature. Her great-grandfather was Jacob Garson, and he ran a garment factory. And Emma Goldman describes how she walks into his office to ask for a raise, and she notices that there's a vase with flowers on the top of his desk, and she had tried to buy the flowers for herself, and she knew that they cost $3 a week's worth of wages. So she walks in and she asks in broken English, can I have a raise? I need to be able to buy a book. Seems like a pretty good justification. He responds, "You have very extravagant tastes for a factory girl. I can't afford that for all of my workers." Thus ends Emma Goldman's attempt to gain a wage, a living wage. In the late 1880s, she marries a man named Jacob Kirshner, who's another Russian Jewish immigrant, and they live in downtown Rochester. Emma Goldman gets one thing from Jacob Kirshner. Under the then relevant immigration laws, she acquires United States citizenship. That's her understanding. She is now an American citizen. Sure enough, it doesn't work out. She goes to the Jewish divorce courts, the Bet Din, and she gets a divorce from the rabbis and the team there. And she's ostracized by her family because she's divorced in the Jewish, small immigrant Russian Jewish community. She's completely shunned. She leaves town in the late 1880s. She goes to New York City. She finds out that things there aren't all that much better. So she comes back to Rochester, and she marries Kirshner a second time. I'll explain that, but at some point that becomes critically important because she never gets a divorce from the second marriage to Kirshner, and that gives her American citizenship. Sure enough, she's emboldened in 1887 by the massacre at Haymarket. Let me go back here, sorry. Oh. Did I miss it here? No. All right. The Haymarket massacre occurs during a strike in Chicago in 1886, and what happens is it's a peaceful protest strike until someone throws a bomb into the crowd. The bomb goes off, a number of police officers are killed. They arrest 7 of the protesters. 4 of them are eventually executed, even though they can't actually prove that they devised the bomb or threw the bomb. But the outrage that accompanies the Haymarket massacre eventually comes to roost in Emma Goldman. And I just want to bring out how vehement was Emma Goldman. Her father invites a house guest to have dinner with them. And during the course of the conversation, after she's been attending meetings and listening to orators talk about the Haymarket massacre, the guest, an older woman, says, "Well, really, who cares about them? They're just protesters. We don't." Emma Goldman jumps across the table and starts to strangle the woman. Her family pries her off this older woman and says, "You can't act like that to a house guest." And she says in her autobiography, "Out, out, or I will kill you." That's Emma Goldman to the voice of a family friend at the table. And this starts Emma Goldman down the path to anarchism. She begins to listen to socialist speakers in downtown Rochester. She reads Die Freiheit, which is a paper with Brecht, a deep hatred of the powers, preparing the crime. This becomes the publication of new ideas for Emma Goldman. And she says in her biography that she spent hours reading this and devouring every line on anarchism. And what it leads her to do in 1889 is 20-year-old Emma Goldman leaves Rochester behind. In her autobiography, she says Rochester was just not a place to live. There wasn't enough going on. It was a drab industrial town and not worth staying in. Emma Goldman leaves Rochester and begins the passage of becoming an anarchist. She has a boyfriend named Alexander Berkman. And what's interesting about Berkman is Berkman gives Emma Goldman the first taste of violent anarchism. In 1892, during the Homestead strike in Pittsburgh, a man named Henry Frick was the president of the plant in Pittsburgh. And Berkman, who at that time was Emma Goldman's lover, he goes to Pittsburgh armed with a pistol and a knife, somehow gets into Henry Frick's office, at the Homestead Steel Plant, shoots him twice, stabs him once, but doesn't kill him. And Berkman is charged with attempted murder. He's eventually sentenced to 14 years in prison. And that means the end of his relationship, of course, with Emma Goldman. But it's the first time that Emma Goldman sees anarchistic motivated violence right at her doorstep. And that becomes critically important. In 1893, she's at Union Square in New York City. She's charged with inciting a riot because she gives a fierce speech about anarchism and about how it's time for the people to rise and overthrow the industrial machine in the United States. She's charged with inciting a riot at the Union Square. She's tried, she's convicted, and she's sentenced to a year in prison. She's 24 years old. She goes to prison. She there becomes a midwife and a nurse. She uses her time to develop some skills. And she does one other thing. She becomes fluent in 5 languages. She can speak German, she can speak Russian, she can speak Lithuanian, she can speak English, and eventually she can speak Spanish as well. She's not only a fiery orator, she can communicate with just about anybody in the street. And she eventually goes to Paris, where she leads the International Congress of Anarchism in Paris in 1900. This is Emma Goldman in 1900. She was a fiery orator. Just remember, this is before the era of microphones. You had to have a voice that could project in a crowd. Emma Goldman clearly had it. She was fluent in 5 languages. She was a trained nurse. She began a career as a prodigious writer and polemist. She became a world traveler and a national celebrity. And importantly, and this is another part of it, she was a marriage critic. She described marriage as a poor little state and church begotten weed. Eventually, in the latter part of her career, she became an advocate for birth control and for women's rights. All that was part of Emma Goldman as early as 1900. But there's another piece to this puzzle that we need to explore, and that's a man named John Hazel. John Hazel was a lawyer in Buffalo in the 1880s, and he became the Republican Party boss in Buffalo. You need to understand something about post-World Civil War New York. It was one of the staunchest Republican states in the Union. Hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers had fought in the Civil War. They came back after the Civil War, and the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the early advent of the American Legion, was just filled with with New York State veterans who had participated in the Civil War. John Hazel controlled Buffalo's delegation in the state. He was a delegate to the 1896 convention, and he helped elect William McKinley as president. He actually became a friend of William McKinley's. He had close ties to the Republican establishment, including the Senator Thomas Platt and a former assemblyman who served as an assistant secretary of the Navy in the McKinley administration. Sort of an obscure guy, that former assemblyman who was an assistant secretary of the Navy. We'll find out that he may play a bigger role than we anticipate. This is a picture of John Hazel in the Buffalo's political boss. The world changes in 1898. The battleship Maine blows up in Havana Harbor. Remember the Maine, the hell with Spain, and sure enough, later history would dispute whether the ship had actually been exploded by terrorists or whether there was a hole in the ship that leaked into its boiler, but nonetheless, the collapsing Spanish Empire brought war fervor to the United States. And the Yellow Press demanded war by the blow-up of the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor. What happens and how John Hazel gets involved is that one of the things that they need to do is there's a rumor that the Spanish fleet is coming to New York and going to bombard New York. So the Assistant Secretary of the Navy says, we need defense. We don't have any ships. We need small ships to defend New York Harbor. So the Assistant Secretary of the Navy puts out a notice that says we're going to buy yachts from the New York Yacht Club to patrol Long Island Sound. And sure enough, John Hazel ends up, as a lawyer then, representing one of the people who's going to sell one of these ships. The government buys it for $80,000. It's converted into a minor warship, a very minor warship, and sure enough begins to patrol Long Island Sound. And the interesting thing, of course, is Hazel has discussions with the Assistant Secretary of the Navy about buying this little boat. It's kind of an inside deal between him and the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Who's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1898 while they're negotiating the purchase of this boat? It's a man later became famous, Theodore Roosevelt. Hazel is negotiating with Roosevelt, and he, of course, knew that John Hazel was a big-time Republican in Erie County. Sure enough, after he negotiates the purchase of Hazel's friend's boat for $80,000, Roosevelt leaves, he forms the Rough Riders, he rides off to San Juan Hill, and he becomes a superstar in 1898. He returns to New York, and John Hazel, who's the Republican boss from Erie County, says, you know what you ought to do, Mr. Rough Rider? You ought to be the governor of the state of New York. Hazel helps Roosevelt get the Republican nomination, which he does. Roosevelt, in his autobiography, said that John Hazel was one of the two most important people who made me governor of the state of New York. All right. So, as 1900 dawns, Roosevelt's the governor of the state of New York. Hazel is a lawyer with political influence. And what happens in 1900 is William McKinley's vice president is dead. He's got to find somebody to fill the ticket. And sure enough, the New York Republicans want Teddy Roosevelt out of the governor's office. He's a progressive Republican. He's way too liberal for the conservative Republican Party. We got just the job for him. Why don't we make him vice president? A job that Alvin Barkley once described as not worth a bucket of spit. And they take Roosevelt on the ticket with McKinley. He takes the vice president's nomination. McKinley's healthy. Everything seems fine. It doesn't seem that there's going to be a problem. In 1900, after Roosevelt goes on the ticket, the United States Senate created a special district in western New York, a new district, and they needed a federal district court judge. Sure enough, who would they look to? It's going to be a district in Buffalo and Rochester. How about the political boss who was a friend of McKinley's and backer of Roosevelt? John Hazel becomes the nominee. He runs into problems. He has no trial experience. There are hijinks in the yacht sale, which later become public because the boat that Roosevelt paid $80,000 for was appraised a year later for $20,000. Might have been a little inside deal there. Anyway, it looks as though Hazel's confirmation is imperiled because of his political activities and his deal with Roosevelt. The bar associations weigh in. The Buffalo Bar Association, dominated by Republicans and judges who had been elected by Hazel, says, sure, make him a federal judge. The Rochester Bar Association says, not a chance. The guy has no experience in what we need. He's not an experienced trial lawyer. We can't put him in that job. The New York City Bar Association, which had influence in those days, describes Hazel as unfit, and he says that the Senate and McKinley should abandon the choice. The Chicago Bar Association, because of the importance of Buffalo as a port in the Great Lakes, they weigh in and say he knows nothing about admiralty, which is important in the Great Lakes, and therefore you shouldn't endorse him. The New York Times opposes his nomination. However, the Senate, because the United States senators owed Hazel an obligation because he had been one of those who had supported their designation in the Assembly. Remember, this is before direct election of senators. This is when the Senate was elected by the legislature. Hazel controlled the Buffalo delegation, and he, in essence, had installed the senators, both Depew and Platt, at his behest. So they were ended up approving his nomination. Hazel goes to sit on the bench. So we get to the summer of 1901. And before we get there, there's nothing on the slide, but I wanted to mention this. After the American Civil War, assassination becomes one of the tools of political change. Abraham Lincoln's assassinated in April of 1865. Interestingly enough, a number of assassinations follow. James Garfield is assassinated in 1801 in Union Station in Washington by a disgruntled employment seeker. There's a great book called The Destiny of the Republic that you ought to read about how Garfield dies not from the bullet wound, but he dies because the chief physician who's overseeing his medical care is looking for the bullet in his abdomen and can't stop licking his finger before he puts his finger into Garfield's abdomen to find the bullet. He dies of sepsis 3 weeks after he's shot. But other assassinations occur. We talked a minute ago about Alexander Berkman had tried to kill Henry Frick in the Homestead Crisis. He was shot a number of times. The Russian Tsar, Alexander II, is killed by a bomb in 1881. The President of France is killed in an assassination in 1894. Umberto I, the King of Italy, is killed in 1900, literally about 8 months before McKinley dies. And sure enough, as we'll get to in just a second, McKinley is shot. And how does it happen? Emma Goldman in 1901 is giving a lecture in Chicago. And after the lecture is over, a man walks up to her and introduces himself as Mr. Neiman. And he says, I was really inspired by what you had to say. I'm convinced that anarchy is the right thing for America. And I'm going to do something about it. She says, fine, go do what you want to do. He walks away. In September 1901, McKinley comes to Buffalo because of the Pan-American exhibition. He meets Hazel, who's now a district court judge. He tours Niagara Falls with Hazel, among others. And later, at a reception at the Pan-American exhibition, Mr. Neiman approaches William McKinley, and at short range, fires 3 shots into him. Kolgush is the assassin who shoots McKinley. This is the assassination site at the Pan American exhibition in Buffalo. McKinley was literally in front of the stage when the assassination occurred. This is the anarchist assassin, Leon Kolczyk. He's a Polish immigrant who had listened to Emma Goldman give a lecture. Sure enough, this is Kolczyk in prison. Not a very happy guy. He's imprisoned in Buffalo. We'll get to the details of his trial in just a second. But what happens is there's a manhunt, a woman hunt for Emma Goldman. Why? Because when Kolczyk's elected, he says, I was inspired by Emma Goldman. I went to one of her lectures. I heard what she had to say, and under those circumstances, I decided to do this. There's a nationwide hunt for Emma Goldman. She's eventually located in Chicago. When she refuses to give her real name. She is unwilling to participate. And sure enough, she's arrested by the police. Meanwhile, Hazel's in Buffalo. McKinley hadn't quite died yet. He had been shot. He wasn't dead. And he's trying to find out whether Goldman committed a federal offense because he wants to try Emma Goldman for the murder of William McKinley. And he's got to find a statute in order to be able to do that. And sure enough, when Emma Goldman is questioned about the death of President McKinley, one of the questions to her, aren't you happy that McKinley is dead? And she says, certainly not. What a foolish question to ask me. We have hearts. We are grieved to see persons suffer, whether they suffered from an assassin's bullets or from the starvation due to the greed of capital. If you knew Emma Goldman, she couldn't make that statement without throwing that last line in, right? It's one thing to be shot by an assassin. It's another thing to be starved by all you capitalists. That is classic Emma Goldman. Anyway, sure enough, McKinley dies. And what happens? Well, there's a telegram delivered to Theodore Roosevelt, who's in the Adirondacks, and it says, "Come to Buffalo. McKinley is dead. You're the next president of the United States." And sure enough, this is Emma Goldman during her arrest in Chicago. She's 32 years old. That's Emma Goldman in her mugshot when she was arrested. Goldman evades prosecution. And interestingly enough, there's no federal conspiracy statute for killing a federal officer unless the federal officer is on federal property. That was the crime, and because he was on state property at the exhibition, she couldn't be charged with a crime. The only issue was whether there was a state prosecution for murder against Kolchak, the shooter, and Kolchak eventually absolves Goldman. He said, "I was inspired by what she had to say, but we never discussed shooting or killing the president or anyone else." The Chicago police who arrest Emma Goldman conclude that she has committed no crime and that her First Amendment right to speech was protected and something they couldn't do anything about. Sure enough, Theodore Roosevelt is then sworn in as President of the United States. I'm going to ask you all a simple question. What's wrong with this drawing? What's missing in this drawing? No? Where was it happening? How far from Eastern Kodak Company was it? Why is there no photo of the moment when Teddy Roosevelt was sworn in as President of the United States? This is the only representation I've ever seen of Roosevelt getting sworn in as President of the United States, even though photography was well available, as the picture of Emma Goldman so adequately demonstrates. Just a sort of a funny little example of the inconsistencies that sometimes occur. Now, the other thing I wanted to tell you about assassinations before we go on to the next slides is technology makes political assassinations popular. And what is the technology? Several pieces of technology. First of all, in the wake of the American Civil War, Colt built what? What did Colt build? What did they develop? The Colt Company? They developed small revolvers that had multi-shots. The revolver that you see in the Westerns, those revolvers were everywhere. There were no restrictions on anybody owning any weapons. Anybody in the world could walk into a store and say, "Give me one of those revolvers and give me 6 bullets." Because if I shoot and miss the president the first time, I may want to try to shoot him again, right? All you got to do is pull the trigger. Technology changes the weapons. You don't have to, the guns were effective at about 20 yards, so you didn't have to be standing right next to them as you would with an old-fashioned weapon. So the guns are better. And the other thing that happens is because of technology of printing, this may sound far-fetched, but printing gets much cheaper. Paper is cheaper. Printing is cheaper. Propaganda is cheap. I'm always reminded of a story of my own family. My great-grandfather told my father before he died, he lived in Clayton, New York. And he tells a story about picking up a newspaper, and it said, "Abraham Lincoln is dead." It was 2.5 weeks after he'd been shot. The advent of printing presses, the mail and transfers and telegraphs meant that political propaganda could be suddenly publicized all over the world. That's why assassinations, better technology and weapons, better publications, easier access to information began to change the role of political assassination in political change. But in any event, Theodore Roosevelt is sworn as president. The Kolchak trial is a foregone conclusion. He's tried within a month. Scott, what do you think, a month? He's tried within a month. There's no insanity defense. He doesn't get a chance to plead insanity. The trial lasts 3 days. It costs less than $5,000. 2 former judges, friends of Hazel's, defend Kolchak. He's found guilty. There are no appeals. He's executed 3 weeks later. 3 weeks later. He does declare that Emma Goldman had nothing to do with his crime. Here's the jury. Not a lot of diversity. In 1901, women were not allowed on juries in New York State. So my guess is if you had a mustache and declining hairline, you were going to get the job. But no women need apply. And of course, you don't see anybody who's other than a white male, right? That was the jury that convicted Goldsing. After the assassination, Goldsing goes underground. She's harassed by everyone because they're convinced that she had a closer link to the assassination. Remember, she had been Alexander Berkman's lover at the time he tried to kill Frick. Everybody assumed that the fix was in, that Goldman had actually put this whole thing together and that she was the one responsible. But she goes underground, she works as a nurse, she stops writing and speaking, but just for a while. In 1905, she publishes a magazine which eventually became sort of the leading radical magazine in America. It was called Mother Earth, and she became its foremost advocate. She was a prodigious writer, and she gave speeches all over the country. I believe the numbers show she was arrested more than 10 times after 1905. And she becomes a thorn in Teddy Roosevelt's side, the president, because, of course, he's convinced that she had a part in the assassination of McKinley, and she's talking about anarchy and the ability to challenge the government of the United States. Roosevelt, who was never shy about putting his cards on the table, described her as a pervert and said a madwoman. And the question becomes, how is the United States government going to get this anarchist who's riling up people in the streets, who was involved in the assassination? How are we going to get justice against Emma Goldman? That's the next part. Here's a picture of her on the stump. You can see that she commanded a crowd like nobody else could. And oh, by the way, my guess is that there was a law in New York at the time, I'm not sure, Supervisor Frankel may know, she's here, that you had to wear a hat in public. I mean, if you look at it, there's not a bare head in the whole crowd. I never got that one. We have a couple people with hats on in the room. You're probably following the law. But back then, you had to have a straw boater or an Indiana Jones hat, I guess. Anyway, that's here's what happens. How does the United States government get revenge on Emma Goldman? Well, she's an immigrant. And she has citizenship because she married another Jewish immigrant who told her that he had American citizenship. In the first decade of the 20th century, much as you find the uproar today about immigrants and their role in America, the United States Congress went after immigrants in a big way. In the Red Scare, but even more importantly, there were laws against Jewish immigrants, Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants. It was like a whole-scale attack on those who were coming and stealing American jobs. Of course, they brought with them the technology, the ideas, and the initiative that paved the way for America's most powerful century. But at the time they came, they were not welcome. And they included in those changes in the law that said you could acquire citizenship through marriage. Roosevelt sigs the Justice Department on Emma Goldman, and they begin to investigate her claim to citizenship in 1908. And here's the kicker. When she marries Kirshner, he's an American citizen, but he had been naturalized as a citizen when he was 17 years old. Federal law in effect at the time said that you could not be nationalized as a citizen unless you were 21. And under those circumstances, because he was a minor when he was naturalized, even though he was an adult when he married her, nonetheless, he had no claim to citizenship. The federal government files an action to strip Kirshner of his citizenship. Where else? Where would you do it if you needed a friendly judge, you'd go to Buffalo, New York, and file it in front of Judge John Hazel, who had a lifelong antipathy to Emma Goldman. And there's no question, when it's filed, and no question throughout the remaining course of the proceeding, is that the federal government has no concern about Jacob Kirshner. They can't even find him, as it turns out. They're not interested in Jacob Kirshner. They simply want to strip him of citizenship so they can take away Emma Goldman's citizenship. Scott would appreciate this. How are they going to find Jacob Kirshner? They can't find him. So they put a little tiny ad in the Rochester newspaper that says, if you are Jacob Kirshner, come to Buffalo and defend yourself because we're going to take away your citizenship. It's a little tiny ad because they can't find him and they can't serve him, and there's a serious question as whether he's even still alive. His father testifies, his subpoena testifies against him, and confirms that he wasn't of proper age when he became a citizen. Emma Goldman is not a party, although even the New York Times, as I'll demonstrate in a second, knew she was the target of the proceeding. They didn't care about Kirshner, they cared about Emma Goldman. Hazel, without opposition, signs the order voiding Kirshner's citizenship, and in doing so takes away Emma Goldman. She's now a woman without a country. Hazel, in my view, has now extracted the final revenge for her participation in the McKinley plot. This is a copy of the article. Everybody in America, everybody, knew that the citizenship proceeding had nothing to do with Jacob Kirshner. It was all about revenge against Emma Goldman, stripping of her citizenship, which, as a consequence, happens. But Goldman is not going to turn off her advocacy. She's a famous figure now all over the country. She joins with Margaret Sanger in advocating for birth control. She gives fiery speeches. She's arrested and convicted several times. She is a frontline advocate against Americans' participation in World War I and advocates against the draft. This may sound familiar to some of you who are thinking about where America might be going today, but just offhand, Congress declares war on Germany because of unrestricted submarine warfare in April of 1917. And when they do that, they pass a law that says you cannot advocate against the draft. It's against the law. Your speech doesn't matter. It's a crime. And sure enough, what's interesting about it is Emma Goldman is arrested the day after the statute is signed. The day after it's signed. She's tried, she's convicted, she's sentenced to jail. But, as we'll see in a couple minutes, her opposition to the draft was actually very personal. And I'll explain that in a couple of minutes. Who becomes the chief prosecutor against her? A newly minted lawyer who's working for the Justice Department. His name, John Edgar Hoover. When he became the chief of the FBI in the 1920s, he dropped the John and just was known by the initial J. Edgar Hoover. He haunted Emma Goldman in 1919. I think it's fair to say that John Edgar Hoover haunted American presidents for the better part of the remaining century. Hoover knew more about people's personal lives and their fallibilities than any human being, perhaps up until now. I won't go any further. But J. Edgar Hoover was the chief prosecutor against Emma Goldman. She's deported. She's released from jail. She's arrested. She's deported under the Alien Deportation Act because she's a criminal without citizenship, and she's an alien anarchist. We talked about J. Edgar Hoover. She's deported to Russia, and when she goes to Russia, she's a superstar. Everybody in America knows who she is. Everybody in Russia knows who she is as well, including Vladimir Lenin, who asks to meet with her. She meets with Lenin. She has a conversation. She spends about a year in Russia, maybe a year and a half in Russia, and she comes to a simple conclusion. These guys aren't out to fix socialism and do better things for the people. They're just a bunch of power-hungry people who want to oppress the populace. Communism is a complete charade. She leaves Russia. She sneaks out of Russia. She eventually lives in Germany for a period of time. She wanders around Europe looking for a home. In 1925, she marries a Scottish coal miner. And what's interesting about that is she was still married to Jacob Kirshner. She had never been divorced. And the question was whether Kirshner was still alive or not. And she decided that she hadn't heard from him in 25 years. She was going to act like he was gone. Which, sure enough, she does. She marries a Scottish coal miner. And who's going to tell me why you marry a Scottish coal miner that she never met? Never met him. Got married in, I believe, Birmingham, England, in an arranged marriage and never met the guy. What citizenship did it give her? She was now a member of the Commonwealth of Nations. She could go anywhere that was in the Commonwealth. And what does she do? She moves to Toronto in the latter part of the 1920s. And here's what happens. She establishes herself in Toronto. She starts writing her autobiography. She does a whole bunch of stuff. But her family is in Rochester, New York, the Goldmans. And she wants to go visit her family. The problem, of course, she was deported and she was a criminal, and so she couldn't get a visa. She intercedes with who? Theodore Roosevelt's cousin, who was the President of the United States. Franklin Roosevelt gives Emma Goldman a visa to leave Canada and come back to Rochester to visit with her family. This is a picture in 1934 of Goldman crossing the border when the border guards were checking all of her papers to find out whether this was Red Emma or not. And sure enough, she comes back to Rochester. And here's the concluding part of the story, which always amazes me. Rochester embraces Emma Goldman when she comes back to town. She comes back as Mrs. James Colton, not Emma Goldman, and she speaks to Rochester's Cities Club, which is filled with all these Republican industrialists who were so afraid of Emma Goldman. And she says, "Please don't feel that I have made a sacrifice, that I am a martyr. I have followed my bent, lived my life as I choose, and no one owes me anything. I'm no more respectable than I ever was. It's you who have become a little more liberal." The crowd gave her a standing ovation. At the end, she said that her mission was to make people thinkers. I don't want converts to my credo. I want thinkers. I am not an agitator. I am an educator. What's the response? This is Emma Goldman addressing the women's group in Rochester, the anarchist who's suddenly lecturing people in Rochester about how the world has changed. Interestingly enough, the newspapers no longer saw her as a danger. It's worth reading both of these. These are the Democrat and Chronicle and the Times Union. The Rochester Radical not only embraced the terrifying cult of anarchism, but took provoking delight on the title of Red Emma. Shocking conservatives was her specialty. Some of the radical views of Red Emma of a generation ago, which aroused the native, now appear as shocking as the daring bathing suits of that time. And the other newspaper said, "We welcome this stocky, gray-haired woman. Red Emma is no longer scares the little boys nor the fidgety old men. She's just a nice old lady." That's the impression that Emma Goldman leaves on the Rochester community after she comes back. A couple quotes about her. "Liberty will not descend to a people. The people must rise themselves to liberty." And probably her most famous quote is, "If I cannot dance, I do not want to be a part of your revolution." An insight into what was into her heart and soul. But the final fact that leaves a mark on Rochester is what Goldman's family does. Emma Goldman was by far Abraham Goldman's most famous daughter. She was not his only daughter. Her daughter, Helene, got married, and she married a Hochstein. and her son David Hochstein became the world's most famous child prodigy violinist. He played his violin all over the world. He won a competition in Moscow before the First World War. He won a competition in Berlin before the First World War when he was young. He was, I think, 11 or 12 years old. He became the most famous. George Eastman sent him on a worldwide tour. The Musical Courier said he's one of the finest violinists America's ever produced. The New York Times described him as an excellent violinist whose style is sound and substantial, his technique very trustworthy, his tone extremely beautiful, full and beautifully played at Carnegie Hall. He was America's next supreme violinist. Emma Goldman advocated against a draft because she was concerned that her nephew would be drafted into the United States Army. Sure enough, after she was imprisoned, David Hochstein enlisted in the United States Army, told his parents that he could not leave his adopted country without serving in the United States military to beat the Germans in the First World War. 3 weeks before the armistice, he was killed by a German bullet in the Argonne Forest, never being able to get to his potential as a violinist. George Eastman, upon learning that David Hochstein had been killed, Emma Goldman's nephew, endowed a school for music students right here in Rochester, New York, now and forever known and named after him as Hochstein School. If you go to the Hochstein School in the front foyer, there's a memorial to David Hochstein and his tremendous potential as a violinist. The message I want to leave you with is that the world was changing around Emma Goldman. By 1934, when she returned to Rochester, the landscape had changed. Because of decisions by the United States Supreme Court, the intervention of Franklin Roosevelt, changes brought about as a result of the Great Depression, minimum wages, a ban on child labor, limits on working hours. Social Security hadn't been adopted yet, but it was well on its way. Recognition of labor unions as part of the public discourse. Most of these had become law or would become law shortly thereafter, certainly during the remaining course of her lifetime. Both Hazel and Goldman lived to see the transition. Hazel retired from the bench in 1931. Eventually, he lived in Buffalo. He died in 1951 at age 90. Emma Goldman went back to Toronto, where she continued to write her autobiography and complete other works. She died there in 1940 at the age of 71. She was buried in Chicago right near the site of the victims of the Haymarket Massacre, which had originally inflamed her passion for change. That's the story. I'd be glad to take any questions. They're in the back, yes. Well, I think the biggest mark they left was the Hochstein Music School, and her sisters were significant parts of the Jewish community in the first 30 years of the last century, and they were very active in Jewish charitable organizations. I am still researching one of the interesting questions. Baden Street, the Baden Street Settlement House, which was originally founded by the Jewish community, I believe, was significantly funded in part by Abraham Goldman. So the concern of for the Jewish immigrant community in Rochester, the Goldmans were very much on the front edge of all that. And what's interesting about it, and it didn't play a part in this research, but it was something that I became aware of, is I had never been aware of the difference and the antagonism between the German Jewish community and the Russian Jewish community. They lived on different sides of Joseph and North Clinton Avenue. And there was a a competitive spirit between those who spoke German and those who spoke Russian. What's interesting to me is Emma Goldman was entirely self-educated. There's very little evidence that she ever went to school, but she became a prodigious writer. I mean, she probably wrote 14 or 15 books. She was a wonderful speaker, and she did it all herself. She did it all without notes. And she spoke 5 languages. And those are incredible achievements for someone who never saw the inside of a classroom after she was probably 12 years old. Remarkable thing. I don't know that. I don't know that. I know she is not. She's buried in Chicago near the Haymarket victims. But I don't know that. Sandy? Well, I think at least based on what I know, that's certainly a part of the explanation. The Jewish community in Germany in the latter part of the 19th century and the early stages of the 20th century was prosperous, had done well in Germany. The Russian immigrants that came to America were all from the farms. They were, I'm going to use a phrase, I hope it doesn't offend anybody, they were Tevyev communities. They were Fiddler on the Roof communities that the Russian immigrants came from. And the Germans had an easier way because they could get directly from German ports to America. The Russians usually had to sneak out of Russia and then try to figure out how they could find passage to the United States. They came from different social groups that were based on the prosperity that Jews had found in Germany versus the mostly rural populations of Russian immigrants in the latter part of the 19th century. Other questions? Yes, sir. I would certainly think that anybody who lost, well, let me go back. I think legally, they were entitled to take her citizenship away because he was not an adult when he was naturalized. So when you think about what's the legal argument to try to get her citizenship back, she was never naturalized. I mean, from the government's point of view, she never had it. So giving it back becomes more difficult. Do I think that she deserves to be considered one of America's foremost advocates for social justice? The answer is absolutely yes. And between everybody in this room, wherever you're online, she was an international humanist. The fact that she worked and lived in the United States is important to all of us, but she was an international figure talking about justice for the underclass. And if there are a way to make it happen, I tell you, we ought to have a federal law that gives her American citizenship. She's buried in the United States. So, Scott. All right. Right. Well, what's very interesting about it in research for an article I wrote on this topic, the issue of what you could say in a pamphlet about the draft was actually decided by John Hazel in, I believe, 1922, when he wrote an opinion that said being against the draft in a pamphlet is protected free speech. We've got to reverse the conviction of a guy who had been charged with publishing a pamphlet that was against the draft. So Hazel sort of, in my opinion, sort of resurrects his sense of justice when he says that you've got a free speech right, you can't be convicted. But the problem becomes is even if you wipe out the conviction for opposing the draft, which honestly was a blip in America's free speech movement. By the 1930s, the Supreme Court had said that we can't do that. That statute's unconstitutional on its face. But even if you eliminate the crime of opposing the draft, you don't go back, and it ties in with the point I made earlier. She doesn't get her citizenship back. But here's the interesting thing. If you void the conviction, then you can't deport her. Right? She's a resident alien, but she's committed no crime. And under those circumstances, she was entitled to stay in the United States, and they shouldn't have deported her. There's a fascinating article that was just published about the lawyer, the Jewish lawyer who represented her when she was facing deportation, who took on J. Edgar Hoover in the federal magistrate's trial about whether she should be deported or not. He represented her pro bono for like a month. And it's sort of a fascinating story about it. But the bottom line is getting her citizenship, other than it would take an act of Congress to do it, because under the then current law she wasn't entitled to it. So anyway, thank you all very much for coming. I hope it was educational, gave you a little glimpse into what life was like 125 years ago. America changed. Emma Goldman pushed that change along, and I think that's her greatest legacy. So thank you very much.